Thank you everyone for coming today. It is really my great pleasure to welcome Dan Russell to Drexel. Daniel Russell is a research scientist and Uber tech lead at Google, where he has been working in the area of search quality with a focus on understanding what makes Google users happy, skilled, and competent in their use of web search. He's sometimes called a search anthropologist because of his focus on understanding how people use technology to amplify their intelligence. Dan earned his PhD in computer science, specializing in artificial intelligence at the University of Rochester in New York. Prior to coming to Google in 2005, Dan worked at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Apple, and IBM's Almaden Research Center in San Jose, California. Dan has also been an adjunct lecturer on the engineering and computer science faculty of the University of Santa Clara and taught special topics classes in artificial intelligence at Stanford University. He enjoys teaching, learning, running, and music, preferably in all in one day. And to contribute a little bit to that, we have a nice little gift for Dan. It's a nice shirt to keep you fit as you run. So it is again really my pleasure to welcome Dan, and from now on the stage is yours. And thanks so much again for coming.
Thank you. I really want to tell you a story today. I really want to tell you a story about my quest for literacy, or at least my quest to understand what literacy is all about, because it started a couple years ago when I was thinking about this activity I do. I teach a lot. I probably teach as much as any faculty member here. I teach classes online, offline, in person, out of body, anything that whatever works. And in thinking about it, I realized that Google is many things to many people. And so it's a little bit like trying to teach life skills, right? You can do it, but it's tough to get your hands on it. So one of the things that I find really intriguing is the way notions of what it means to be a literate citizen now have changed so much over time. Because you know what literacy used to be, right? It was just this basic skills. But I think now we live in a different world. It's a very different world than the one, say, that you and I grew up in. Once upon a time, we thought about a world like this, where this is the collection of all the world's knowledge, right? Now, what I find intriguing about this is when you live in a world like this, you think, this is it. This is all the world's knowledge. But when you live in a Google world, you realize that this is a very small, but a heavily curated collection. I didn't know that when I was 12. And yet, the world is very different now because, kids say, Dad, you don't understand. And my daughter, who's 15, asked me, what computer games did you play on the internet when you were a kid? I thought about that for a little bit. I realized that Vint Cerf still hadn't invented basic TCP/IP protocols. And I thought, there was no internet. And she couldn't believe that, right? Just could not understand it. And so I started thinking, how do I teach her a historical perspective on what it means to look things up online, what it means to actually engage in play online, and so on. And I come from a particular perspective. My job, as Alexander has described it, is to be technically the senior research scientist at Google. But really, the way I think of myself is a cyber, tribal, techno-cognitive anthropologist. And I try to do at least 10 impossible things a day, and that's one of them. So I really come at this from this perspective of trying to understand how people use tools, how they use tools in groups, how they think about tools, and how they misuse them or use them to extend and enhance their cognition. So from this perspective, my job is to really think about the tool of Google and how it changes the way people think about knowledge, how they think about literacy, and how they think about doing knowledge work itself. Now, at the same time, I'm also a software engineer and research scientist and part-time dilettante. But what this gives me is a particular perspective, these combinations of anthropological perspectives and software engineering perspectives. There are not a lot of people in the anthropological community who know what jQuery is and can use it hand-to-hand combat. Right? So one of the things I started thinking about was, from my background as an artificial intelligence person, I was deeply interested in the fundamentals of representation. Now, you might have seen this kind of representation before. It's just written script, but you notice anything odd about it? Where are the spaces? This is scripted continua, and this was the way language was written out before the invention of this critical representational tool called space. Now, what is space? It's literally nothing. It's just a slight movement of pixels or of ink or something to demark where the word boundaries are. And it's not, in many ways, a natural thing. When you listen to me speak, you don't hear the spaces, right? When you look at a speech form, there are no spaces. And so the transcription of word into phonemes, into letters, into words, does not naturally lend itself to adding this representation of space. But when you watch someone's eye scanning this page, it's an exercise in frustration. They're going forward, they're regressing constantly. What they're doing is searching for the semantic boundary between characters. And so the introduction of something as simple as spaces dramatically improves your reading speed. Dramatically improves your speed of thought. And I started thinking about what this means in terms of literacy, because I realized that one of my avocations is to be a calligrapher. And so one of the things I do is sit around and occasionally calligraph a word or a text or something. And here's a short video of me representing the word behold using 4 different technologies. This is me calligraphing using traditional quill dip pen, the word behold. It takes me about 25 seconds to write it out. And if I were a medieval monk, I could probably get it down to 20. But I'm not going to get it down to 2. There's a lot of back and forth, and this is a lovely, serene, beautiful operation. It marks me as a literate scholar to be able to do this. How many of you use diplomas? Okay? Occasionally, for a very special purpose. This is not your day-to-day stock and trade, is it? But now if I shift to a different technology, that of felt tip pen, it reduces the amount of time by half. All of a sudden, I can take the speed of thought and capture it much more quickly. Now let's switch to another technology, me typing. Before I finish typing the word, Google guesses the extension of the word. And it actually can pronounce it. I can now speak it.
See or observe.
It will define it. So what we've done is gone from a very slow input, a slow output technology that's driven and limited by the rate of ink on paper and movement of your hand. And God help you if you make a mistake. Right? All the way to something which is very, very rapid. And these technologies fundamentally affect the way we think of language, the way we think of thought, the way we think of knowledge. And I find this interesting because searching for information is one of the fundamental aspects of what it means to be a learned citizen. You know how to find stuff out. So when questions arise, the speed of technology and the technology affordances that we have influence the way we think in a deep way. So I was sitting on a park bench in San Francisco one afternoon, and this caterpillar comes racing across the bench at me. And I'm thinking, poisonous or not? Can I pick it up or not? How would you answer that question while sitting on a park bench in San Francisco? Well, one way you could do that is actually take a picture of it and then use search by image. Quick question, how many of you have used search by image before? Okay? It's interesting. That half has, this half hasn't. Huh. So what you can do, though, is take that picture and drop it into the image search box, and it will actually tell you, there it is. It's the spotted tussock caterpillar. That took me about 0.3 seconds, and if you include taking the photograph, another second and a half, you see where I'm going with this. This is not the dip pen of search. This is the typing model. This is a very rapid access to information through a mechanism which you might not have thought about before. What would you have done 5 years ago? You would have moved away. I don't know what that is. It's going to take me a day to figure it out. I'm not going to chance it. Right? So when I'm thinking about what literacy means, we think about the sort of ordinary definition. The sort of English language definition of literacy has always been the ability to read and write. Correct? But I think that's really out of date. And in fact, in English, we imbue the notion of literacy with more than just the ability to read and write. It's actually a bunch of other stuff as well. Now, I'm at Google, so what do Googlers do? They do searches, they do studies, we do experiments of various kinds. So the first thing I did is I went to Google and typed in literacy in books, Google Books. And it turns out you can be literate about anything. Statistical literacy, baseball literacy, emotional literacy. Trust me, for any noun, there is a literacy book about that topic. Snake literacy. It's not them being literate, it's about you being literate about them, right? So what fascinates me about this is the way we think about literacy is heavily built into our culture in an interesting way. We also have this Enneagram corpus at Google, which is the statistical analysis of all the words in the English language corpus in books since 1800. And if you look at here, this is the occurrence of the term literate or literacy over time. What was wrong with the 1800s? Why didn't they talk about literacy? Well, they didn't. It's interesting. Only about the late 1800s, early 19th century, people started talking about this. And this is a time when there was this great sort of flowering of the public consciousness about what it means to be literate. The 19th century founders of the American Public Library movement believed deeply that universal literacy was the best way to inoculate the working class against the blandishments of radical orators. So it was a deeply important thing for that time. And you can see it's kind of gone up since then. So I did a more recent analysis. I looked at the query volume in English for the words literate and literacy. The blue line is the word literacy. And what I found so interesting about this is the past couple of years. Query volume over the past couple of years for those two terms. And what's fascinating about this is if you look at the averages here, what you get are these repeating downward cycles. Tell me, what starts in fall and ends in the beginning of summer? Okay, school, right? And that big dip, ignore that, that's the holiday dip. You see that in every grade. But that's a fascinating trend. So we're, as a culture, are interested in literacy only in September. Only at the beginning of the school year. So it makes me think, what is literacy? So which of these can you read and write? How many can read and write this? Anybody? Okay, one. Chinese, anybody? A couple? How many people read and write this? Okay, more and more, excellent. And you know what this is, right? Regular expression defining legal email address. How about that? Gotta be kind of old. Excellent. Sorry, but we are old together. This is a line of APL, an old programming language. This is the game of life in one line of code. So let's think about this for a second. What about topic literacy? Can you name the top wine producers in the Carneros region of Napa Valley? Am I not literate because I don't speak Chinese? Kind of an interesting sort of relative culturalism about literacy. Because if you come to Google, of course, we'll ask you a question like this in your job interview. We'll say, hey, if I give you a chessboard that's n by n, can you place n queens on that chessboard in such a way that they will not mutually attack each other? I never expect you, as a literate algorithmicist, to do something like this on the whiteboard. That's capturing an interesting cultural idea of an algorithm, a sequence of steps you go through in order to establish a particular state, a particular output. Are we not literate? What does it mean again? So what I want to propose is that in the 18th century, in order to be literate, you had to know how to make a pen. You would carry around with you an oak gall and just a little iron, a little knife to cut the goose quill. That's why it's called a penknife. Okay? Thomas Jefferson had this. He was a literate person. Okay? But it's more than the ability now to just read and write and create penknives. Okay? It's operationally defined with respect to your cultural group, be it the Arabic speakers, the Chinese speakers, the APL writers, or the Pythonists writing code. So it has implied with that this sort of assumed body of knowledge. I need to know in Python what an array is and how to create one. I need to know in Chinese, I need to know a lot of sort of cultural references in order to understand something as simple as, say, Jade Rabbit. If you're a Chinese speaker, you probably know what Jade Rabbit refers to. But if you're in the United States and you hear about this rover on the moon, and it's called Jade Rabbit, it sounds like a cartoon character, right? But if you're Chinese, there's a deep cultural resource that you're tapping into there. So for me, literacy means knowing enough about a domain to be able to read and write, answer questions, and function critically. That's going to be my going definition here. So let me ask you this. Speaking of the evolution of literacy, was Socrates literate? He couldn't read, he couldn't write. The only reason we know anything about Socrates is because of this guy, Plato, who was his student, who did read and write. You probably know that Plato basically was a faithful, or relatively faithful, transcriptionist for the things that Socrates said. Now, Socrates comes out of an oral tradition where the point of being learned and being literate in that culture is to be able to make an oral argument. And so in Phaedrus, in 370 BC, Plato records Socrates' thoughts about this, and he says basically, if you use the technology of writing, you will be only having the semblance of truth and not the reality of it. You will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. You will appear to be omniscient, but generally know nothing, right? Does this sound familiar? This is the same critique that's leveled against the internet. Substitute a couple words, you have exactly the same argument. Bottom line for me, this is a technology. Writing using, say, chisel on stone or quill on paper is a technology for capturing knowledge. Just as there's a shift from oral tradition to a writing tradition, we are seeing a shift now from representing content in one form to another. And accessing that is fundamental to the way you think about it. So, for example, my main point here is that as we shift our technologies, including the technology of writing, including the technology of algorithms, say, alphabetization. Think about that. Alphabetization is a recursive descent process by which you put something into a canonical sort sequence. Okay? That's the fancy way of, say, putting things into a library shelf in order, so you can go access it effectively randomly. So what happens is that reading and writing are technologies that are in use. We don't think of them like that, but they are, and they are fundamental to the way we think. So a fundamental literate skill, I would say for our culture, is knowing how to use indexed knowledge. Now this is an index, right? You don't think of it that way, but it's really a giant index. Sorted how? Well, it's whatever the sort sequence is for this particular library. Maybe it's Library of Congress sort sequence, maybe it's Dewey Decimal sort sequence, it's whatever, right? And of course, when you go to fiction, it's sorted in a different order, because it's by author, not by subject. Okay? Interesting to think. One of the things to know about libraries is that the farther a book is away from the index, the less likely it is to be accessed. Librarians know this. It drops off actually as the cube of the distance. So something that's, say, half a mile away, forget about it. It's basically never accessed. Cube of the distance, which really is the amount of time it takes to get to the resource. So imagine a Google that was like this, where you filled out a postcard, and at the bottom it says, please allow 30 days for search results. This morning, I typed to Google weather Philadelphia. After I got over the shock, I realized that I would never do that with this. Right? Now, I thought this was just a ridiculous sort of funny cartoon I found somewhere, right? But what's interesting is that there actually was a system called the Mindtools. This is built by these crazy Frenchmen, Paul Autelet and Henri Lafontaine. You might know them as people from the high school, people probably know their names. But this is a very faded version of a query to the system that they built called the Mindtools. Mindtools was, quoting here, translated from the French, a system to organize the world's knowledge. Does that sound familiar? It sounds exactly like this mission statement of Google. So here is an exhibit from the Medallion. This is actually an implementation of their algorithm, how to compute an answer to a question. So they would get a postcard like this, which is asking a question about the economic structure of Belgium. They would go through a process like this, and then they would go to their resource, which was a giant rack of filing cabinets, not like this. And in that, they would have these little cards. They pull out the cards and compose an answer. Interesting. The world, though, is different. Anybody use this technology? This is the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Did you? Anybody up there? Okay. This is a horrible technology, as anybody who's actually tried to use it will attest. It's basically, for those of you too young to have ever used this is a periodical update to an index, which is then concatenated to the last issue. And so to actually do a query, say for something like high technology industries, which is what I'm doing here, you have to do the current issue and then go back to the previous issue and the one before that. And if you're lucky, you'll get to a compendium, which is the last n issues all put together. Most libraries I worked at never had that. And so you would end up spending an hour just trying to compose a few references to go then into the stacks and pull out the correct. Remember that? That's horrible. It was the bad old days. It really was. Of course, now you can go to Google and do that same query and get 200 million results in a quarter of a second. It's a very different world that my daughter inhabits versus what I inhabited as a child. So what's interesting is to think about how this changes the way you think about knowledge. Because remember life before Google? This was true. And it was deeply true. And it's another instance of that, the time of access property. If it takes you more than a certain amount of time, in this case, if you're sitting on your living room couch, it's going to take you at least an hour to get out of the couch, into the bicycle, down to the library, go through the periodical literature, and maybe find that one's checked out. Okay? The world is very, very different. The time of access of information is now radically different because I can pull out my phone and do that query. Or I can touch my temple and say, high technology industries, and watch the answers appear in under half a second. So now we're almost to the point where you can issue a query at the speed of thought. How does that change things? I want to argue there are two big ideas in this talk. The first one is this, informacy. This is the literacy of information. Yes, I know there's this thing called information literacy. This is not that. Informacy is knowing about information qua information. You know what an index is. I'm not going to try to teach you how to use EBSCO or JSTOR, right? I want you to know what an index is and what a sort order is. I want you to understand what filters are. So informacy is knowing how information is organized and how you use it, and not a particular extension of that. Not the one that you have, say, in some OPAC that you've got working here on campus. Does it have wildcards? Does it have date restrictions? Can you validate the metadata? Right? This is what I mean by informacy. It's knowing what the information is, what kind it is, where it comes from. It's understanding it deeply. For example, what is an index and how would you use it? Would you recognize that the card catalog was an index? Could you take the card catalog and resort it? No, you could not. But with an index now, of course, if they have any kind of decent tools, one of the things you can do is filter, sort, reorganize. Here's another kind of basic informant tool, informacy property. If suppose I give you a long web page like this, and this is the web page results from a particular 8K race that was held near me. And I want to say, how long did it take me to run that race? About how long did it take you to find the answer? What's the time of access? 5 seconds, 10 seconds. So if you know something about information, you know that if it's online, it's findable, it's searchable. And so one of the things that I found fascinating in my field studies is how often I run into people who don't know this. If you type Command F or Control F, like this, I can ask you a question. How long does it take Beth Hassan to run this race? Okay? Now, being at Google, I did what all Googlers would do. I ran an experiment. So I invited 85 people to come do this. Now look at this chart. This should floor you. Okay? So you see over here, a lot of people took 30 seconds or less. That's kind of what you'd expect. These people know Control F, Command F, or edit find. They know how to find the text, right? So what are these people doing? Answer, visual search. They're scrolling line by line by line. Let me tell you, it is a killing experience to watch someone doing this. This is about 55 screenfuls long, that set of race results. And they're going line by line. You want to rip your own lungs out. The other thing that's fascinating about this is that once they take more than 2 minutes, a quarter of the answers are wrong. And this is for a trivial problem. A trivial problem. All they have to do is copy the number and paste it into my answer form. A quarter of them got it wrong. What's going on here? One of the things that's going on is people just don't know this. And I did this large survey, and I repeated this multiple times, so my N is now roughly 5,000 or 6,000 people. 90% of the internet using population in the US does not know this. That means there's somebody in here who doesn't know it. Right? Now, lest you think this is only an illiterate population I'm surveying, I actually asked a whole pile of 500 US English teachers, K-12, the ones who are teaching our kids, half of them don't know it. So now when I give talks to teachers, this is sort of the meta talk, I usually give a very practical talk. And I measure my talks in oh my gods per hour. I like to write 5 or 6 oh my gods per hour. This is one of them. Because when I teach teachers how to use Control F or Command F, someone unfailingly in the audience says, oh my God. And they realize how much of their life they're wasting. And so naturally, I quantified that and I discovered it's 12%. So all the time that you spend searching, if you don't know Command F, you waste an additional 12%. That means if once I teach you this, you get 12% of your life back. That's a big chunk of your life. And we start to think about how long it takes you to find information. This radically transforms the way you read text. We did an analysis of a bunch of Firefox users, the same number. Now, what's interesting is that knowing something like Control F is more than just knowing how to find. Because if you use Chrome, for example, lots of browsers support this, there is this little thing in the upper right corner that says how many instances of the word it found. So let me show you this quick video, because I took this actually. This is a live video of me answering the question, how many times the word behold appeared in the King James Bible? It is 35 seconds long. This is my query, and this is not edited in any way, it's just a raw recording. I took it, I did the query, I went to Gutenberg.org project, downloaded the entire King James Bible, opened the file in my browser, there it is. I go to the upper right, Command F, type the word behold, and if you look at the far right, you see the yellow bars? That's every instance of the word in the entire document. So you see what this means is that in about 35 seconds, I discovered it's 1,349 instances of the word. You can do that only if you know that that is the way it works. See what I mean by this notion of literacy? You need to know that you can turn the page to get to page 2, or roll the scroll, or basic line, use the technology to get access to information. This is an interesting property. The other thing about Control F, suppose I'm looking for a word like, say, internet in the King James Bible. How often does that appear? You don't know, do you? Well, we can do this and prove it doesn't exist. How often do you get the skill to prove the negative? Almost never. Control F does it for you. What other informant skills are there like that not only tell you a deep property like the number of instances of the word, but other things like it's a negative result? Now, it's not just the general populace that are idiots, it's us too, right? So this is a true transcript of a conversation in my office. Mr. C says, what can I do to stop my phone's volume from constantly changing? And my buddy sitting next to me, Mr. B, says, I wish I could do that too. And so naturally, I thought about, did you ever think about searching for an app for that? How? Search for the app, right? And the number one result is it, right? So there's an interesting thing going on here. Googlers are ostensibly literate people. They're ostensibly informative people. But there's this kind of blindness that we have sometimes. And Leslie, you think it's not, just other people. This is my question. I asked this, I began with Mr. B and C in my office. I said, gee, I wish I could do Control F for more than one thing at a time. I want to do like an or, X or Y. Mr. C, the same guy who asked that question originally, said, hey, do a search for Chrome regex search. I hadn't thought about that. Chrome has the ability to add on different capabilities. Regex stands for regular expression. Remember the email pattern I gave you earlier? Oh, I can type all that into my search box in Chrome? Yes, you can. So here it is. I did Control F in my Chrome box, and I said Google or Facebook or Apple. That's what the vertical bar means. Sure enough, there you go. Or I can type in a real regular expression, 2 \D \D \D, which is the pattern for any 4-digit number starting with numeral 2. Go to a web page, run that as a find command, and I can now do rocking regular expression search inside of my text files. Okay? Why should you learn regular expressions? Because the kinds of stuff you can do are like this, change the way you think about text, just in the same way that Control F allows you to find. All of a sudden, text is now very malleable and inspectable in ways that didn't occur before. So for example, if I'm in high school English class and I say, when is Starbuck the character introduced in Moby Dick? I expect it will take you about 10 seconds to figure out it's in chapter 21, the second paragraph. How do you think about Moby Dick now? How do the structural elements come out? Because it's all inspectable and interpretable in ways you hadn't thought about before. So to reiterate this idea that there's this deep cultural notion of literacy, I want to tell you about a few genres that we have on the internet. You probably know about a lot of these. Home pages, bookmark pages, web directories. The one I want to focus on today is this one, the spoof site. Everybody knows what a spoof site is? It's a fake website. It's totally bogus, but you may not know it. Here's one. There's a million of them out there. This is probably the one best known. Preface. There is no such animal. This is bogus. Okay? But yet, every year, thousands of kids turn in well-intentioned biology reports about the Great Pacific Northwest Tree Octopus. And what's worse, some of their teachers accept it and say, wow, that's really great. Thank you very much for teaching me about this. And so the vogosity increases exponentially. What a world we live in, right? You have to understand not just the tools and technology, but also the cultural embedding of these things. You need to know that spoof sites exist. And for a really good time, go check out the dihydrogen monoxide website, which is another spoof site, for which city councils have passed regulations against dihydrogen monoxide. Go look at it. Okay. So another example of this kind of cultural embedding is that when people write, they're writing with respect to the people who are going to be reading the items that are in that culture. For example, we all know about emoticons, right? You can read emoticons, right? Or you know what acronyms are, ROTFL, and so on. Now here's my favorite example. Is it true that Rosa Parks would have moved to the back of the bus, but she was listening to her iPod? True or false? This is from a QA site. And the answer, chosen by the asker, is yeah, it's true. The asker then says, I'm going to give you 5 stars for that. I'll put it in my report. I trust you. You have the nicest avatar. The nicest avatar is no basis for assessing credibility. Let me tell you that. What went wrong here? The asker didn't understand that piece of semantics. That is an emoticon, which is the universal symbol for sarcasm. I'm kidding you, ha ha, right? It's a logical equivalent to LOL, right? But if you don't know that emoticon semantics, you're going to believe her. So it's interesting because we live in this interesting internet world where there's not just a lot of stuff, you know that, but there's compendiums of this stuff. And the way to think about this, it's really like one Library of Congress is being added per day, and it's getting worse. It's not just one per day, it's one per day per week. What this means is that when I was a graduate student, I could go and read my entire literature for my field, and I might have been the last student to be able to do that. It's now changing in an interesting way. So for example, videos are a well-known genre type, a well-known media type. Look at the numbers here. Every minute, 100+ hours of video are being uploaded. Some of that is cats. Some of that are people talking about my field. There are 3 billion videos being watched every day. Let's put it this way. I can't even keep up with the videos about my field, let alone the papers, let alone the books, let alone all the websites, right? I can't keep up with any particular genre type, any particular media type. Now, luckily, we live in this world where we have tools to help us deal with this, because if you think about it, during the course of this talk, 250 days worth of video are going to be uploaded to YouTube. That's 7/10 of a year. I can't even look at the funny ones. But tools are a fantastic thing because this is sort of the prime mover and shaper of our cultural world. Now, this is a Handex from about 2 million years ago, Paleolithic Handex. And what's important about that is it changed the way we dealt with food. It changed the way we dealt with our environment. And tools evolve. There's a wrench that allows me to do something that I could not do with my hand axe or my fingers. So there's this weird conceit that sometimes people have about tools make you weak. The wrench does not make me weak. The wrench makes me capable. So we have this interesting dilemma. Do you believe in tools or not? Tools evolve as well, of course. There's a tool that allows me to do particular kinds of plumbing, right? And I can't do that with my hex wrench, my open-end box-in wrench. There are also specializations of tools. Anybody recognize that wrench? Okay. Did you ever have one used on you? No. Let's hope not. That's a tooth wrench. Don't ask. Just go look at it. Don't look at the YouTube video. Trust me. You don't want to know. And tools adapt in interesting ways because there's now this bionic wrench thing which actually senses the shape of the nut you're trying to get off and adapts itself. So not only are there new kinds of tools, but there are new genres of tool types, right? Including dynamic adaptable tools. And that's the world we live in. So this is Google Maps as of 2005. Right? This was when we first introduced the ability to search for places, and so we put the results on the right-hand side. So you can, for example, look for pizza near where I live in Palo Alto. This is next year. We moved the results to the left-hand side. We changed the color. We changed some of the labels. A couple years later, we started taking pictures and logos and telephone numbers and reviews, and then you can see where this is going. We now change the Maps interface about once a year. Oh, twice a year. Right? You see what's happening? New capabilities are being added to this stuff all the time. So, for example, the results have changed radically over the past couple of years. In the past 5 years, we're now to a point where we have fundamentally new search capabilities. I can zoom in on this particular area of Philadelphia and say to Maps, give me a list of all the known entities, all the known businesses and so on in this viewport. That was not possible 5 years ago. I can get the terrain map of this area of Philadelphia, see the relative elevations. I can see where the public transit goes, and I can email that, I can link it and do whatever. This leads to an interesting observation, and this gives me my second big point of the talk, which is I want to give you this idea about literacy, meta-literacy. Meta-literacy, if literacy is knowing how to read and write and answer questions in a domain, meta-literacy is being literate about being literate. Oh no, you see where this is going. Because we live in a world where YouTube is dropping an hour, right, 100 plus hours every few minutes, we have to figure out how we, as literate users of information, can adapt. We have to know what the user interface is, we have to know what the information structure is, and more to the point, learn how to learn about the next one. Give you an example here. This is a Maps interface from a few years ago, where we see that little image, little icon right there, little triangle. It's 16 pixels wide. Anybody use it? You're the only person on the planet who used it. Almost nobody used it. Why? Because nobody knows it. We go to all this trouble to make these changes, and then nobody uses it. Or this one. There's another one. Let's use this one too. It was cool. It kind of gives you the ability to move like a god over the whole space, but nobody used it. So these things change a lot. So, for example, now if I ask for a map of Rome, this is what I see on my screen. Not just the aerial image, but an outline of the whole city of Rome, as well as we know it. Who knew, for example, that Rome had a fractal boundary? It's crazy in there, right? You can walk across the street and be in different cities. So my point is that we live in a world where the tools are not just, you're getting new tools every week, but they're changing some substance as you watch. It's happened to me before. While I'm doing a demo, the tool changes. It's always interesting to see. So what I really want to get to, though, is what happens to us as informivores, as people who consume and use information. It changes what's possible to ask about the world. Right? The caterpillar, remember that? I could not have done that 10 years ago. I might have, if I was highly motivated, gone to the university library and found the caterpillar index key and gone through it, and the very first question would have been something like, is this caterpillar in instar stage 5? Instar. What's an instar? You see where I'm going? Now, of course, that's a single click away. We read text differently, we scan the world differently, we ask different kinds of questions because of the adaptation of tools. So for example, if I'm just down the street from my house, I could say, what's that tower? And of course, what I would do is pull out my phone, take a picture of it, and let Google Goggles tell me it's Hoover Tower in the middle of Stanford campus. And there's the web page for it. What this means really is that we can see the world in a different way. Now remember what I said about functional blindness before? We don't always think about the tools and what's possible and how information changes. Here's a little story about that. So my son is 17, and he loves Stanford basketball. Loves Stanford basketball. So we go to the game. And you know what happens. You go to the game, and this is what happens. Right? You all know the words, right? Go ahead. Etc. And he says, Dad, I really like that song. I want to get that on my iPod. Wait a second. Shazam is not going to work here because it's a bunch of people sort of bellowing at the top of their lungs on top of the music, right? So it won't recognize it. So no recognizer will pick that up. Okay. What are the lyrics? Oh. And so I said, son, give up. You're not going to be able to get it. You have to ask a friend or something. So he's my son, he's a good kid, but he completely ignores me and types in, oh. And see the very first suggestion? It's the song. He now has this song on his iPod. So what did I not know, right? What did I not get about this? I didn't understand that about 1 million kids in front of them had asked that same question. And the machine learning algorithms go, oh yeah, maybe we should associate this with that. And basically, not only are we adding new search capabilities, but the machine itself is getting better. And the information space is growing. When I started working at Google in 2005, QA sites were nothing much. There weren't many, they were mostly low quality. All of a sudden, that's different now. Now you have things like Stack Overflow, which is a fantastic QA site if you're a programmer. There's a lot of QA sites which are just incredibly great resources. They're like fact files that are being compiled by the culture. They're being put together by people who know. And now you can query them. So this is interesting, because there's this kind of tool blindness that we have. And so I did another little study where I asked a bunch of Googlers, these are people who work at Google, who build the search engines, software engineers. Can you find a picture of this house, 900 University Avenue, downtown Palo Alto, the Squire House? Can you find a picture of this house taken before 1977? An aerial photo of that house taken before 1977. I let them work on it for about 7 minutes, which is about the max time anybody does. Nobody found it. Nobody found it. Now, interestingly, I ran this study in 2011, got 0. I just reran this study last week. And in the course of a few years, how many people got better? Half. Half can now solve that problem. Half of them cannot. Now this kills me because we have this tool for this called Google Earth. And Google Earth, if you didn't know this, has this ability to allow you to slide the time flow back. This is a picture of 900 University Avenue, the Squire House, 1948. You can zoom in and see more detail. Why didn't they know that? I want to argue that that's kind of what meta-literacy is about. It's knowing that your own information about how to use the tools of your information resources change radically over time. And you need to be literate about that. So we have to go beyond this, beyond these simple genres, to understand, interestingly, the way in which the information space we live in changes. The great thing about the library, I showed you at the very beginning, was it was relatively static. If you had a really great acquisitions department, they would bring in stuff, maybe 100 a week. That'd be great if you have a big enough budget. But now it's 100 a minute, 100 a second. So here's an interesting example for you that allows you to think about how to look at content in a way it's changed from different perspectives. So this is the Wikipedia article on Leonardo da Vinci, the outline. That's one that you see on the right-hand side. That's the English language version. Okay? Interesting, right? This is the Italian version on the left that I have handily translated into English for you using Google Translate. So what I've done is I've taken one tool of literacy, the translation tool, and applied it to another tool, information resource of literacy, the Wikipedia article. And look what happens. The Italian article is really big. The Italians care about Leonardo. 23,000 words in the Italian version, a mere 8,000 in English. Put it another way, the biography section of the Italian Wikipedia article of Leonardo is 12,000 words long. It's longer than the entire article in English. The Italians really care about Leonardo. The thing to take away from this is not that the Italians are manic about Leonardo da Vinci, but that every culture, as expressed and seen through Wikipedia, manifests its efforts in things of interest to it. So if I want to learn about, say, Chopin, would I read the English version of Wikipedia, or the French version of Wikipedia, or the Polish version? Right? Start to think about the world not as this American English-only vision, but as a global vision. And once you start to think about combining these tools and how to think about information in larger scope, you start to worry about issues like credibility. So you probably saw this report a few months ago, where there were purported to be sharks swimming through the streets of New Jersey. And of course, Alexis Madrigal did this really nice write-up where he showed that that was in fact a photograph taken at in a suburban context in New Jersey during the Superstorm Sandy. And that shark image is the first Google image search result for shark fin. Didn't take very long for him to figure out how fake this was. You go to the kid's website and put this together, that's his hobby, is spoofing news images. This is not deep science, right? But you have to know about this, because a lot of people were taken in by this. So what I think this means for us is, as Ernest Hemingway said, is that every man should have a built-in crap detector. And anything that's sort of out there like this, you have to figure out Is it credible? That's part of being informative. Part of being meta-literate is knowing how these tools change over time. So one of the takeaways from this whole talk is that change is constant, and the only constant will be that these tools are going to evolve. So people will continue to search for new kinds of things as new kinds of content become available. When I started at Google in 2005, there were no such thing as Vines. There were no such thing as Snapchats. There were no such thing, I can go on, all right? That's all now interesting content to know about. There will be new kinds of media out there, and new properties of old media. The whole process of datafication is taking existing pieces of data, like images or videos or something, and then reverse engineering the information out of it in ways that could not before. There are ways, for example, for going through old photographs and reconstructing terrain or reconstructing how people move about in that environment. So you can take, for example, 20 pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge and eliminate all of the cars and all the people and end up with just one image of the bridge with nothing on it. That's an interesting kind of datafication process. So what's fascinating to me is how all this will be searchable in ways you might not have thought about. This will continue to change and evolve. Let me give you a couple of quick examples here. Suppose I ask you this question. Not where is this building, but what is the phone number of the office from which this picture was taken? You should say, huh? That's crazy to me. I want the phone number where the photographer is taken. Right? How would you do that? Well, let me show you. One way is to actually figure out what city that is. It's not hard to figure out. It's downtown Warsaw. Once you know it's in Warsaw, you can fly around on Google Earth and match the image with the 3D model of all the buildings. And once you have that, you can take the image and then, well, what you can actually do here then is take your 3D model and turn around and look at the building behind you because that's where the photographer is, right? This is not a database operation that's taught to you in Computer Science 101. That is not join on foreign keys, that is rotate body by 180. Now, to get to exactly the office, you look at the picture I gave you and flip the image there and realize, oh, that's the Google office. No surprise here, but what you can then do is look up that street address, and once you have the street address in downtown Warsaw, that's the phone number. 5 minutes max. You don't have to get out of your chair. Changes the world. So when we're searching for these different kinds of tools, one of the key meta-literate pieces that you have to know is that there are tools for things that you haven't thought about yet. People out here in computer science land and startup land making new stuff all the time. So for example, suppose I ask you the following question. You're standing on this beach, Wailea, in Hawaii. What time does the sun rise? Now, if you're a literate person, you might say, I can go to Google and say sunrise, Wailea Beach, and it will tell you. But if you're highly skilled in the art, you would say, but wait a second. That's the time the sun comes over the horizon. But look, if you're standing on the beach, there's this freaking big mountain just to the east of it. Haleakala. Oh, yeah. Okay, so if I want to account for that, then I have to do basic trig. Right? So what you have to do is actually compute theta in order to figure out what the offset time is between the time the sun rises and the time it comes over the top of the mountain. Okay, now I've given you two other hard problems. What's the rise and the run, right? Well, it turns out, let's go back to Google Earth. You can draw a line in Google Earth and say, give me the elevation profile. And it will tell you, there it is. That's the X and that's the Y. But if you don't know that, you'll spend a lot of time walking around in Haleakala trying to figure out where you are, right? Meta-literate point. Search for a tool to help you solve the problem. So, going back to our problem, now we know the distance is 8.8 miles, and the height is 1.45 miles, and you remember basic trig, the tangent is out. You don't remember basic trig. What would you put in? You would Google it, exactly. You would search for the definition of tangent, right? And then you plug in the numbers, and then you realize you've got to figure out the arc tangent, you've got to convert the radius into degrees, and you do all that, and you figure out the time, you go out on the beach, and sure enough, the sun comes up exactly at the time. Great. Now, how many of you really like trig? I know, it's okay. Institution of higher learning, you should know this stuff. But, remember what I said about looking for a tool? Do this. Right triangle, angle, calculator. And there are about 1 million of them out there. Here's one. You can now just plug in those numbers. You don't have to remember what arctangent means. See what I'm saying? Knowledge is being encapsulated within these algorithms, between these tools, in ways that you probably haven't thought about. So what this implies for me is that we're now in a world where, yes, I know we've always said this, that you're in a learning for life situation. Now it's really true, because everything I learned, for example, about immunology back in the 70s is wrong. Everything that I learned about computer science as a grad student is way out of date. So we're now in a world where things like MOOCs allow you to go online and learn and update your knowledge very, very quickly. We are in a distributed education world where this stuff is not just nice to have and optional, it's absolutely required. So last year I had 300,000 students taking my class, my online class. So from my perspective, we're in this world where we need to understand this information content. We need to understand this stuff. We need to understand what's out there, what's possible, the tooling, and that this stuff changes all the time. And we need to emphasize these in our students, in our library patrons, and in ourselves. We need to become meta-literate people and constantly update our knowledge about this. Because when I come back, suppose I come back in a year and give the same talk, I will have completely new examples. Completely new, wonderful things to show you. So what's changing? Everything. My daughter cannot imagine a world where she could not play internet games. The information space in which we're living is changing and changing rapidly. So let me give you a quick example of one direction that this is going in right now. This is not secret demo. This is something I just recorded on the top of my laptop the other day.
Who painted the Sistine Chapel?
Sistine Chapel ceiling was created by Michelangelo.
What is x squared plus y cubed? What is the electron configuration of lithium?
The electron configuration of lithium is He2S1.
Show me a picture of Guernica by Picasso.
Here you go. Some pictures related to Guernica.
What was the name of the dog on the Lewis and Clark expedition?
All right, we didn't get that one. But you see where this is going. All of a sudden, we're transforming search from something where it's a query that you have to kind of speak Googleese in order to get it right, to something which is very conversational. You can, right now, in your laptop, click, just like I did, and ask to speak by search by voice. And you can ask a question like, how tall is President Obama? And then in the next query, say, how tall is his wife? And it figures out who his wife is. So there's deep work going on here, where we're moving towards this very conversational model of search, where you can carry along this idea of what you're working on. And so we're really in this business of making people truly informant, having access to all this stuff. But that's our charge, that's our problem, is to become informant and meta-literate people. Because we're all in this business of trying to figure out what's the next generation tool. How can we make this process of getting access to this deep knowledge in the world even simpler? Alvin Toffler, I think, got it right. He said, tomorrow's illiterate is not those who cannot read and write, but rather those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Right? It's no longer enough to learn something once and now never expect to change it. So we need to teach our students and our patrons, all of us need to learn this stuff, what's possible. So libraries, because it's not the computer science departments, and it's not going to be English 101 that's going to teach you these skills. Where did you learn Control F? Do you know? Answer, I actually know, I've done this study. You learned it from a friend. You watched somebody else do it and said it. How'd you do that? I need to know that. We as a culture are forgetting this basic informacy. We're not paying enough attention to it. And so as I said, I teach a lot of classes, and I want to leave you with one last story. I went to Foster City not long ago, and I was teaching a 4th grade class how to use a bunch of Google tools. And one of the things I taught them was Google Translate. Now, why would I teach 4th graders Google Translate? Because Foster City Elementary is really diverse. 30 kids, 30 languages spoken at home, that kind of diverse. Lao, Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, German, Hebrew, you name it, it's there. And so I said, I gotta teach these kids Google Translate. And it was Miss Wong's 4th grade class. And since it's 4th grade, they all wrote thank you letters, right? And so about a week later, I got this big packet in the mail. And I got this story from a little boy named Armando who said, thank you, Dr. Russell, for showing us how to use Google Translate, because now I can write to my grandmother in Honduras. Because his mother and father don't want him to speak Spanish at home. So he's not learning. And I gave him the tool to allow him to write to grandma. And this is what Armando can do. This is the kind of thing I think we all should be able to do, is not get locked into a particular vision of how information is organized, because the world is going to change. Our accessor tools, the information itself is changing, and we need to recognize that this is one of these eternal tasks to develop this new literacy, this new worldview. We're now perpetually in school because the information world is shifting constantly. We need to practice fundamental skill of how to learn. Great. Thanks very much. I didn't run too far over, but I think we have time for questions, right?
Yes, absolutely. We have hello? Works.
Oh, she's got one in the back. We have a few minutes for questions, I think she would say.
Absolutely. So we want to use this microphone. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand, and then I will run to you and give you the microphone.
Do you see, or how do you see things like spoof sites and the like in terms of art forms of the computer age? I sort of feel like there has to be sort of an expressive, using these tools for both not just acquiring information and sharing information, but learning about ourselves, which is what art does.
So it's a good question. There's this kind of continuum, and I think it has to do with the intent. A spoof site is intentionally not trying to mislead you, but trying to show you how critical skill credibility assessment is. So there's another great website called something like All the Discoverers or something like that. I know how to find it, I don't know if I'm the time. But it's a fantastic website, beautiful like this one, really high production values and everything. And Trioctopus and the Discoverers website are both made by teachers for the purpose of teaching. And if you dig deep enough, you'll find the webpage that says, note for the teachers, this is all fake. Here's how to teach this, right? So the intent is very clear on that. Then over here, there are disinformation sites, okay? So for example, in the bag of political dirty tricks, there are now candidates who are having websites put up in their name by the other party. So you can imagine how they spin the information, right? And so anytime a new candidate comes up, they are well advised to go get all the domains, yourname.com, yourname.org, yourname.net, joesmithisajerk.com. Just proactively go and reserve all those names, because that's active disinformation. It's not an art project. You're actually trying to propagate information that's wrong. And the problem is, it's very difficult for a search engine to know that. So it's still on you to try to figure that out. Now, one of the things we did recently was we provided about this site, a little gray link on the right-hand side of the result. So if you search for something, let's say, John Smith, you will see a little gray link that says where this information comes from. It'll give you a background information, sort of metadata about that site. For example, this is the World Health Organization. They're a function of the UN. They were organized in 1948, blah, whatever the information is, right? So we're trying to do what we can to provide that information, but the difference between sarcasm, art, and disinformation is subtle, right? And we don't know how to do that. Another question?
I don't need the mic.
Because of the recording?
No, if you're recording it,
It's not for us, it's for the video.
So I was a little surprised. You made this whole argument about the speed at which information is being accumulated and that we need these tools, wonderful tools. And then you made the further point that the tools are evolving very rapidly. Don't I immediately wind up in a bad regress? I spend all of my time learning new tools to access more information, so much so that I can't even actually use the tools. There must be some point at which, at the very least, I stop, take a breath, and say I'm not improving my tools for the next 28 days so that I can actually get work done, right?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. Let me tell you an analogous story. If you worked at Pixar, or any big high-end production company, well, one of the practices that Pixar does is when they start a new movie, they lock all their tools. You are not going to develop anything in this tool. You will fix major bugs, P1 bugs, but nothing else gets changed. And so for the duration of 3 or 4 or 5 years it takes to produce that film, you've got a fixed set of tools. And I think that's actually a rational approach for scholars among us. But what I'm really saying is one of the things you have to do is every so often lift your head up out of the water, look around and say, hey, wow, new tools, look at that. That one walks on water. So you do have to do that periodically. But you're right. You do not want to get locked into this infinite whirlpool going down, because then, but it's interesting to think, that's a little bit like being in 6th grade. If you're a 6th grader and you're looking around at the world of information, holy cow, right? There's so much of it, and this is pouring in constantly. So you have to learn an adaptive strategy, is what I'm saying. And we all have to do that. Not only for information, but for tools as well. So you're right. But what I do, and what I recommend to you is I subscribe to a blog about search engines. I've been subscribed to both Google and Bing, but do whatever. That way, at least you kind of get a one a day. This is the cool new thing that's coming out. I pay attention to other information blogs like TechCrunch and stuff like that. But I limit it. You gotta limit it. It's like those social media sites. You gotta limit it. Otherwise, you end up going down the rabbit hole. And I guess the third thing is I'm very aware of how much time I'm spending on all these things, because you know what happens with kids. They don't have great executive control skills yet. And so they I'll spend 5 minutes on Facebook. 2 hours later, they don't know what's happened. That's a problem we all have. So as an adult, this is something to model, but it's also something to be aware of for yourself. Sorry, no magic bullet. That's what I would do.
Hey, so as a general question, I was just wondering, since you have an idea of where we came from and where we are now, where do you see information and tools moving over the next 10, 20 years?
Let's see here, 10 or 20 years. Google started in 1998. I'm not going to project that 20 years. So it's an interesting question, because I used to have a career as a futurist. I say that in past tense because because once upon a time I actually had a reasonable model about how to predict things. So I had these beautiful charts, for example, about storage density increases, about how it was basically going up super Moore's law, and you would get more density, more information. So you can go now and buy these terabyte drives that are like this big for $100. And I have a curve that predicted all that. It's great. But then you get these massive disruptors of new information sites, new information kinds, the rise of real-time social media like Twitter and so on. I didn't predict those because those are disruptive events. So I basically got out of that business. This is too hard. So over the next couple of years, though, I can predict that our conversational stuff is going to be better and better and better. And so if I was to go to the second hour of this talk, I would talk about how the skill of the future is really knowing how to ask the right questions. And my teacher in 5th grade said, Dan, it's knowing how to ask the right questions. But she didn't tell me how. I have a whole pile of heuristics about how to ask the right questions. And basically, that's another set of skills that you have to learn, because you'll be able to have these extended conversations with your machine. So that's where I think it's going to go in the next couple of years. So think Star Trek. Without the bug where you can say, compute the last digit of pi, because the system will say, oh yeah, that's a ridiculous question. I don't understand it. Question?
So I'm glad you brought that step in what we think of as sort of the process of literacy in contemporary terms if we're thinking about information literacy. It's really that ask the question. So I'm glad you came to that, because actually my smart aleck answer that I'm surprised that you didn't answer to the last question is look it up on Google. And the thing that's missing is that process of thinking about it. The examples, it blows your mind away, the stuff that you guys are doing, and the ability to quickly find information. But that's just such a small piece of the process of really applying literacy, being a thoughtful person, or creating new knowledge from that information you're doing. And so I'm glad actually the way that you've come around to thinking about the future, you've got to ask the right question. And then the next piece of some of those things that we're shown is, how do we even evaluate if that's the information that's going to help you think about the next thought or stimulate the creativity of what's the next question? And I'll just end with one little reaction. It sort of puzzled me in your talk. You showed the picture of the building in Warsaw, and you showed it, and to me, I thought for sure that was the Miranda building on Market Street here in Philadelphia. And I kept looking, I said, of course it is. So first of all, is that genuinely right? This is going to be a trick question, and this was a Photoshop trick that you pulled in. Or more interestingly, is what does that trigger about, is that the same architect? Or how does that, so what is it about my thinking of visual literacy, and what did I miss, what did I not see, all those kinds of things. So somewhere in all of this, it's not, I think where we make incredibly quick, and obviously Google has been amazing to help us quickly find information and see. But now, as you're saying, this next phase of how do we think about the thinking process, right, and how does this simplicity or activity help generate young minds and old minds to learn and to be excited about those next stages in the thinking.
Yeah.
So
Well,
where is that going to go?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It also gives me a chance to plug my blog. So search for Dan Russell blog, and if it doesn't show up in the first result, I will have failed. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because that's the question I ask every week. So every Wednesday, I ask a question, a search challenge, and I say something like, here's a good one. Here's a photograph of a bunch of green trees. What kind of trees are they? Question 2, why do I hear a bell ringing? Okay. Now what's interesting about that question is you can actually answer it based on nothing but the information in that photograph, both of those questions. But you have to know how to do that. And furthermore, you have to know how to assess it. So there's this skill of actually doing the first step, extracting the exit metadata and all this jazz, right? But then there's the larger question of how to actually think critically about that. And so I've written now for 4 years every week about exactly that problem. How do you do that next step of critical thinking, and actually then checking the assessment, doing credibility checks, what kind of next question does that bring up, and so on. So I recommend my blog. I hope a book comes out of it at some point.
So add to that, who cares?
Yeah, and who cares? So here's my little, the thing I've discovered about writing a blog is that I can ask a question about almost anything and make it interesting to answer the who cares part, because I've been astonished. So for example, I was testing the boundaries here, and I asked the obvious question. Parrotfish is a big, beautiful fish in the Caribbean, right? One of the things they do is they go around crunching the coral, and then they excrete sand. Okay? So the question is, if you have an average parrotfish, how much sand does it make in a year? How hard can that be to find out? It took me 2 weeks to figure that one out. And then I wrote in my blog this very long, extraordinarily detailed story about how I figured it out. And it's actually, it doesn't matter that it's 200 kilograms, nobody cares about that. But how do you find the answer? What's the process you have to go through. How do you actually find the scholarly literature? How you then read it? How you then look up the terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That's the interesting part. Because now, once you know that process, you can answer a lot of interesting questions. Anybody else? This is the Alexander workout routine.
Hi, thanks for your talk and about Mindtools. I have a question about your tool for delivering your lecture today. And I have actually two questions. The first is about story, the mechanism of story. You talked quite a bit about tools, and yet your mechanism again for delivery was story. I just wonder how story, if you could talk more directly about that, how that fits into your definition of literacy. The second question is more light-ended. Have you seen the movie Her, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, I did see Her. So I'm a real fan of stories. And actually this morning I was driving here thinking that how can I make this more of an interesting, compelling story? I hope, and so I actually think about this a lot because the presentations I prefer are the ones that have a classic story shape. So when I started the talk, I said this whole thing began as a story to understand what literacy is about. And I tried to make it interesting, compelling all along the way. Now what's interesting with respect to search is that people are usually not doing storyful things when they're searching. So they're usually trying to answer one tiny piece of a question. What's the population of Japan? What's the population of Japan over the past 50 years? Right? That kind of thing, which they then take that information and put it into a story. So what we're doing right now at this point is trying to help people create their stories by giving them data, information that they can weave in. We don't know how to create the stories yet. I don't know how to write a program to do that. Now, I have another video like that last one, where I was talking to the computer, which is almost story-like. And I asked the first question, what are the Northern Lights? Oh, that's what they are, okay. How are they created? What's actually the mechanism? And we go through this long conversation where you're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the story behind the Northern Lights. It's not a classic story, beginning, middle, end, plot, narration, actors and all that. But it's one of these things where you can start to have a conversation which feels a little story-like. So it's an interesting thing. So I'm a fan of good stories and presentations. I hope there was a story here to got. Now, about Her. So, true story. Everybody at Google has seen Her. Everybody's seen Her. And it's sort of interesting and scary at the same time. Truthfully, I don't know if we're going to get there to that level of sophistication anytime soon, but it's not beyond the pale. Right? There's a lot. So, for example, y'all know about ELIZA? Okay. If you don't, the quick version of it is Joe Weizenbaum at MIT wrote this very simple program that emulated a Rogerian psychologist. Basically, you would type something to it, and it would echo back the question. And it turns out writing that program is very simple. I used to sign that problem in my AI classes, write ELIZA. And people would go off and write it. And then they would turn in these long, I'm not kidding, 40-page transcripts of their conversations with it. And they knew how it worked. They wrote the code. And what was fascinating about the ELIZA experience is how deeply people penetrated into that experience, and they would get deeply, deeply engaged into it. And then I stopped assigning it because I started learning too much about my students. I mean, my girlfriend broke up with me, and it was clear that it wasn't made up. I can't assign this anymore. And that's from a long time ago. That's from many years ago. So there's a whole category of work in an area called chatbots. You've probably heard about this. And some of them are getting quite good. If you're interested in this, go look up the Loebner Prize, Loebner, I think, Loebner Prize, which is a competition every year among the best chatbots in the world to compete and see if they can pass the Turing test. And the Turing test is, if on a blind examination you can't tell the difference between a program and a human, program wins. Right. Go check that out. Some of those are really good. There's one called Cleverbot, which is very, very, very interesting. So the rest of the story, I don't know about using body doubles as a program avatar, but we'll see. I love the story. I love that movie. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Anybody else? You need to put that in football. And then
This is more of a thank you and a request. So my kid's school district was hiring a librarian. I think that they hired her in the fall, and I was in discussion with the administration, and I said, well, why don't you hire somebody from a progressive information science school and have them team up with a technology teacher and teach them information literacy? And he said, oh no, we have English teachers who teach that.
oh, right.
And so they ended up hiring someone who has actually a disdain for information science. And I guess I wish I'd known about your book, because I could have, at least told them about that. But I guess my request then is to maybe go to some education conferences and talk to teachers about this, because they have a very different understanding of information literacy and the education discipline than they do in like information science and computer science. And it's exactly those types of skills which are actually not being taught very much in the K-12 school systems in the United States.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And I actually do about 10 keynote talks at education conferences a year.
Oh, you do? Okay.
So I do. But I haven't been invited to AERA or, in the big ones, right? So I'm doing these little ones. I'm doing like 500 at a time, people at a time. And that's not going to scale. So one of the things the reason I mentioned the MOOC, having 300,000 students is really interesting, because has anybody here taken my MOOC, by the way? Nobody? This is like the first time. What's wrong with Philadelphia? Because, so for example, I went to the Library of Congress, and I was giving a little talk there. And so I've given, in my MOOC, I have the regular basic MOOC, and I have the advanced power searching MOOC. And a bunch of librarians came up to me afterwards and said, hey, how do you do problem solving? It's like, I'm not going to tell you. But it's really interesting to go around, and with that many students, almost everywhere I go, I run into students, people who have sat through 12 hours of my lectures. And imagine this for 12 more hours. So that's interesting, and I think that's one way to get to it, because if I go talk to ERA, it's not going to be 500,000. Right? So my goal for this year, actually, is to get to 500,000 students. And so that's another way to get to achieve that. So I'm trying, I'm working on it.
Thank you. I like your homage to Papert with the title of your talk. That's nice to know that he's still influential. Mindtools, of course, span the whole mental process. Most of what you talked about was the process of access. When I've done research with middle school kids, naive learners, access is really the least of their problems. Evaluation is a huge problem, and what I found another problem is that naive learners really need help learning how to put together pieces of information in a reasonably coherent, reasonably accurate form. You mentioned one tool for helping with evaluation. But I'm wondering, do you see a future for building into what you're already doing any other kinds of tools to support those later parts of the learning process, the evaluation and the creation?
Well, with the creation part, we certainly think Google Docs and Google presentations and all that kind of stuff, right? There's a new tool we just launched called Opia. So there's another OPPIA. So we're doing a little bit in that, but it's not particularly targeted towards middle schoolers or towards education. Well, it is targeted, but that's a nice side effect. The other problem, I think, is harder, the evaluation part. I guess the bottom line for evaluation is it's really hard. And even though we've been thinking about this for years, I honestly don't know how to do it. And part of it is that we have a global reach. So, for example, acupuncture, good or bad? Depends on where you ask the question from, right? If you're in China and you ask that question, it's clearly a good thing. If you're in DC, it's clearly a bad thing. It's just a difference in perspective. And so how do you evaluate things like that? So for example, if we try to evaluate the shark fin, Northern Forum, New Jersey, you're evaluating it with respect to the intention. If it was put out there as a joke, it's fine. If that put out there as real news, then you're evaluating with respect to intention. See what I mean? And that's a subtle thing, and I don't know how to capture that semantics yet. So you're not going to get any automated support in the near term. Sorry. The best thing we can do actually is sort of show, for example, who sponsored the thing. That's what we're trying to get to about the site. Who sponsored it and who else links to it. So who else is citing it in a positive way. So for example, you can find these really, white supremacist sites, and you can see who they link to and who they're linking from, who's linking to them, and in what sense. So that's what we can do it. Yeah.
All right, one more last
One
question.
more.
One more last question.
One more last question. Does that make sense?
You mentioned learning how to use the tools.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you ever Googled about Googling, like Googling for regular expressions, Googling for images, and what you thought of the results. If you ever did something like
If
that.
I Google and say,
Like if you Googled how to Google, or Googled Googling bio,
Oh, yeah.
and what you thought of the results you got.
Yeah. My blog shows up a lot for that. Yeah, actually, so aids and tips and support for how to do better searches using Google, right? There's a ton of stuff out there. Unfortunately, a lot of it is out of date. So for example, a lot of it will say you can use the tilde operator, put a tilde before a term, and you'll get all the synonyms for that term. That doesn't work. But there's a million sites that say it does work. Okay? It used to work, but now it doesn't anymore. There's a bunch of things like that. So it's actually a problem for us because every time we make a change to the way basic search works, we invalidate all kinds of the help material that's out there. So it's a huge problem for us, and we own the help material, right? We have all our own content for that. And so one thing that I always do when I give a presentation like this, once when I'm showing people how to search, one of the presentations I give is how to be a better searcher in 10 steps. Right? I actually teach how to search to Googlers. So I teach the people at Google how to search. Who knew? Right? When I do that, the thing I always do is check to make sure everything I'm showing actually still works. Partly because we take stuff out, and partly because some things that were very, very hard have suddenly become trivial, kind of like the ooh problem, right? And so you're getting this interesting thing, and that's why this whole business about mental literacy is so important. So yes, I've done that. My results are some of the results for that, but it's hard. You gotta keep up. You gotta keep repainting that moving bullet as it flies by. All right. I think we have something outside.
What was that?
We have something outside.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. We do some refreshments. Have some refreshments and snacks outside the auditorium. So please stay around, and Dan will be there. Absolutely willing to take some more questions and chat. So thank you so much, everyone, and thanks, Dan, really, for coming, visiting us, and giving this wonderful talk. And
Great. Thank
glad
you.
to have you here. Thanks.
Great. Yeah.